most of the categories come from work that I do with groups doing initiative and reform, global forums on independent election systems. You guys are doing, again, great on this one. Excellent group, one of the fastest ones I've seen. System takes 200 votes a second, and you guys are really at that rate. All right, last chance on this. And next. Now this is, there's 9 different combinations of social and fiscal issues. This was actually created with the Millennial Group back in 1997. And so from social, are you liberal, moderate, or conservative? And then again on fiscal, we thought this made a lot more sense than just far left or far right. Does that kind of resonate with everybody? Does that kind of make sense? So see how you would identify yourself up here. And it sounds like some spouses are giving advice to each other to remind them of exactly what you're supposed to vote on this one. Excellent, excellent. Thank you for that. And it was great to walk around and connect with some of the participants here tonight. Last chance on this, please. Okay, next. Now, which of the following parties are you affiliated with? And of course, there is one independent, non-affiliated, which means you're not a part of a party at all. As you can see, all of these are in alphabetical order. We always do that so there's no perception of bias. It makes the list because it has a certain percent that are registered nationally. That's why it makes this list, okay? All right, last chance. And next. So how active are you politically? And for those of you that are watching right here, it shows we have one more to go. You'll always see the number of items that we have left. All right, how active are you? This one's taken a little bit slower to think about. That's good. You guys are being thoughtful. That's what we want. Be thoughtful. Excellent. Okay, last chance. Who needs more time to be politically active? We all need more time. All right, here we go. Final one. How well informed or knowledgeable on tonight's topics and issues do you feel coming in? This is not how you think everybody else is informed or knowledgeable. How informed and knowledgeable are you? In all honesty, we've done this a lot, and so the idea of the average person is probably not all that informed, okay? So is that fair to say, everybody? I mean, when you look at results, you look at a lot of polling, is that fair, Mike, to say that the average person is really technically probably not that informed? More than fair. Okay, so just keep that in mind. All right, fantastic, and here we go. So here's who's in the room tonight. Really good balance, great balance there. Great. And then your age. Nice concentration, our college students for the most part, I imagine. And also a nice balance here. An interesting U-shaped curve. Okay, next. In terms of the different roles, 41%, by far the most of us saying engaged citizen, and then student. But they all get at least somebody voting on them. That's interesting. Next. Here we go. So in terms of this framework, as you can see, we really skew up towards here. But then there's a nice little cluster, 21% right in here. But we do, again, get 9% on the more conservative end, which, by the way, is more than I typically see around the country at events. That's great to have ideology and a balance for the most part. Not a balance, but at least ideology from all the spectrum, okay? Next, here we go for parties. So by far, and then independent. But again, notice they all get responses with 15% Republican. I think this is a little skewed from the actual demographics of this region, correct? It would skew more towards conservative. Yeah, okay, great, excellent. Or more towards Republican is what I meant. Okay, so here we go. How politically active? Mostly not in here, but again, look at this right in here. Okay, you guys can see that. We're going to move on. Next. And then the final one, how well informed do you feel? Mostly, as you can see down here, mostly knowledgeable. Again, down in here, but a good range as well. All right, so the first question we're going to ask is we want to get a check-in. How do you actually think about issues before we go into tonight's conversation? I know the text is kind of small. It's because there's a lot of words up there. We wanted to get all 10. They're also, again, in alphabetical order. Can everybody see that okay? Can you guys make that out? Too small in the back. How many of you are having a real hard time seeing this? Okay. Well, you know what? Really, I can't take one out. If I take out number 10, that would make the text bigger, but that's climate change, right? And you just really can't take one out. If anybody's sitting next to someone with good eyes that can help them explain that to them, And again, you are taking a look and saying which one is the single most important one. We know it's a tough decision. We know it's going to make you think and kind of wrestle with which one for you really stands out. And we have a rationale for this, and that will be explained in due time by some of the presenters. All right, nice. You guys are already doing over 100 on this. That's great. Okay. This is about what we thought, right around a minute on this. We're doing great. Doug, we're okay on the speed on this. You guys are one of the faster groups that I've seen, so that will encourage us potentially to do a little bit more towards the end of the night. You guys did that very quickly. Almost there at a full count. Great job. We're almost over 300. Pardon? Any questions? Oh, 10 is at the bottom in the middle, okay? So you do not press 1 or 0. There is no 0. So if you're going to select 10, it's by itself at the bottom in the middle. I'll be repeating that throughout the night because no matter how many times you explain it, somebody's still going 1-0, okay? Great. We're at a full count. Here we go. Let's see what we think before we start the night, what we bring into the room as far as the issue that we think is most important. And it does stand out right here, inequality of income and wealth in the U.S. right there. Again, they all get a vote. Look how many get over 10%. And then we have next, passing a constitutional amendment, and then taking a strong measure and taking steps to reduce student debt. Now, keep an eye at this, and we're going to show you what the women think. So here's what the women think. It doesn't change that much at all. As you can see, this is still number 1, and then the other ones that had 10% plus are still 10% plus. Here's overall. This one changed here, passing a constitutional amendment to give Congress power. You can see how it changes gender to women. And now here's what the men think. So the men feel much stronger on this one, overall, passing a constitutional amendment. All right? Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night tonight. Stay engaged, stay involved, listen to what's going on. You are participants tonight. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Chris. Well, without further ado, let's get started with our presenters. I'd like to thank Dean Epperson once again and William Ostrander with the Citizens Congress to bring this great group of scholars together. The format for tonight's forum is going to be fairly simple. Each of our guests is going to have an opportunity to answer the question, what could go wrong with money, and hopefully provide some insight as to what might go right as well. Each guest will have 13 minutes, after which we will open up the conversation to the audience. There will be microphones available, and we will have people line up at each of the walkways in a single file line. And obviously, as you can see, there's also going to be plenty of opportunity for audience feedback electronically as well, thanks to Chris and our software. If you have a question for an individual or for the panel as a whole, please be brief and concise. We don't have time for a fifth panelist, but we do have time to generate some conversation and unpack what is understandably a very complex issue, nevertheless one of the most important issues that we face. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to Professor Lessig.
So thank you. I'm the lawyer that's left on the table. Trevor's still not here. And so I'm going to engage in a little bit of forum shopping because we've been told 3 different times that we get, and I'm going to pick the time that I like the most. So not 13 minutes is the answer to how long this will go. Number 1. And number 2, I'm a law professor, so I like footnotes. So I'm going to start with a footnote. Now, you're going to think this is not really relevant, but trust me, this will be, I hope, quite significant. So here's the footnote. 2 days before our Constitution was presented to the world, the framers discovered a mistake. This guy, kind of hiding in the back, George Mason, noticed that the draft said that the only entity that could amend the Constitution or even propose amendments to the Constitution was Congress. And he stood up and he said, what if Congress is the problem? He said, quote, no amendments of the proper kind would ever be obtained by the people. Now, this was a kind of duh moment, right? kind of probably gave people a little bit of fear, because if they had this kind of mistake, what other mistakes? Slavery. What other mistakes were still in that document? But okay, they fixed it. And they fixed it by adding to the amending provision, Article 5, this language that says the states have the power to demand that Congress call a convention for proposing amendments. The convention can't amend. It's just a convention for proposing amendments, which, like any proposal, has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. Now, there are two things to notice about this important addition. Number one, it was setting up an ordinary means to bypass Congress. Ordinary meaning within the structures of government. State legislatures could bypass Congress. But what we forget is that it presupposed extraordinary means outside of the process of government. This itself, the Constitutional Convention, was an extraordinary means. It wasn't even called by Congress, technically, and it technically changed the rules by which the old Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, could be ratified. And it did that on the basis of the founding document in our tradition, the Declaration of Independence, which, as Jefferson wrote, articulated certain unalienable rights, and among them the right of the people to alter or abolish their constitution. The people. Not the state legislatures, not Congress, the people. That's what a constitutional convention could do. But Article 5 was not talking about a constitutional convention. It was not setting up the power of Congress to call a constitutional convention. All it was doing was setting up a power to create a convention that could propose amendments, to propose in a regular mode, but one not controlled by Congress. It was a safety valve for a corrupted Congress. Okay, that's the first point, the ordinary means. But the ordinary means here were driven towards an ordinary problem because it was completely predictable that even governments would lose their way, or you could say maybe especially governments would lose their way. Britain had become corrupted. That was America's view of the government in Britain. And throughout history, the Americans reflected about how every single form of republic eventually fell into a kind of corruption. You can't avoid it. All you can do is to prepare for it. And their idea was to prepare through the power to call a convention that would give us a way, not controlled by Congress, to fix the problems of the corruption of Congress. Okay, that's the footnote. Here's the argument. Here's something you all believe. It wasn't quizzed because it's taken for granted. Our government has failed. And I hope you believe money in politics is a core reason for that failure. And as it has failed, the confidence we have in our government has collapsed. We see a polarized partisan stalemate in Washington. Now, many people say, well, what is it? What explains this? And what we have to recognize is that there's a number of changes that explain this. And I tie them back to 1994, when we can crystallize the increasing competitiveness between Democrats and Republicans in Congress. 1995, the Republicans took control of the House for the first time in 40 years. And then from that election on, Congress flips in its control as often in the period between 95 and 2012 as in the prior 40 years. And as that competition gets more and more fierce, we move into the era of perpetual campaigns. It used to be there was a time for governing and there was a time for campaigning. There is no time for governing anymore. There is simply a perpetual campaign. Obama tells us we can't have perpetual campaigns. Of course, he told us that on the way to a fundraiser in San Francisco. But the perpetual campaign now defines how Congress doesn't work. And as the perpetual campaign grows, the time spent fundraising by members of Congress grows. For my book, Republic Loss, I calculated it was between 30 and 70% of the time of a congressperson is spent dialing for dollars, raising money to fund his or her campaign or to get his or her party back into power. Now, the problem here is not just how much time they spend. The problem is also, and critically, from whom they raise the money. Because if you look at who the relevant funders of campaigns are, the people Congress people care about, the people they care about in the sense of, I'm worried about what she thinks when I'm thinking about how to vote. We calculate at most it's about 0.05% of the American public. 0.05% are the relevant funders of campaigns. Now that works out to about 150,000 Americans, which the internet tells me is the same number of people as are named Lester in the United States, which is why in my TED Talk I referred to the United States as Lesterland. And after the Supreme Court's decision in McCutcheon, which lifted the aggregate contribution limits on campaigns, it's going to collapse. The number of relevant funders, I think, is going to be no more than maybe around 35,000, which turns out is the same number of people as are named Sheldon in the United States. So whether it's Lesterland or Sheldon City, this is a technical legal term, it's just bad. It's bad. Okay, it's bad for two reasons. Number one, policies of our government get bent. As members of Congress spend 30 to 70% of their time raising money, they, as any of us would, develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become these creatures who have an intuitive sense of what they need to do to raise money. B.F. Skinner gave us this image of the Skinner box where any animal could begin to learn exactly what it needed to get its sustenance. We need to recognize this is a picture of the modern American congressperson as he or she learns which buttons must be pushed to get the sustenance he or she needs to run campaigns. As they do this, become shape shifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, always lean to the green. Then she went on, he was not an environmentalist. Now, when you say this about how money matters in Washington, the answer you get is there any proof that it actually has an effect? Indeed, I spent the night with a bunch of people who work in Washington, about 25 of them around a table, where they said, there is no proof that money matters to what Washington does. Okay, so is there any proof? Well, I'm not technically, as a Harvard professor, allowed to cite this kind of proof, but from Princeton, this spring, there was released an extraordinary study, the most ambitious study in the history of political science to measure policy changes by our government. And they took this incredible collection and they tried to evaluate whose views matter. When the views of the rich or the business interests conflict with the views of average voters, what does Congress do? And they concluded with extraordinarily powerful statistical evidence, quote, when the preferences of economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy. Translated, the average voter does not matter, while they can show the views of the elite and business interests do matter in predicting what Congress will do. Policies get bent. And as policies get bent, our government gets defeated in its ability to do anything. I'm not talking about liberal things. I'm talking about liberal or conservative things. Doesn't matter. Congress can't act. Because in any world where this tiny, tiny fraction of the 1% is funding the campaigns, what that means is a tiny, tiny fraction of that tiny fraction, this is really tiny here, look, has the capacity to block any change, because just a couple thousand of them need to get together to say, oh, this great idea for fast, cheap internet, inconsistent with our business interest and monopoly control over technology. Any idea can be stopped. And what that means is stalemate government, which we see right now, becomes the norm. Government is defeated. It is bent and defeated. That is bad. And it is bent and defeated because our government is held hostage by the funders of campaigns. And they can't resolve any issue sensibly, so long as this is the way we fund campaigns. So on that list of the most important issues, look, I'm not telling you that my issue, which is the way we fund campaigns, is the most important issue. It's not. The issue you care about, climate change, any of those are the most important issues. But my issue is the first issue, because we will get no sensible reform on any issue until we fix the way we fund campaigns first. And we cannot afford, as a nation, no sensible reform. Okay, that's point one. Here's point two. I've spent the last 7 years traipsing around the world, more than 200 talks, kind of Al Gore-like, these slide presentations. It's really quite depressing. Talking about this issue, and for many of those years, maybe all but the last 6 months, my aim has been to try to prove to people that money in politics, see the way that's kind of cute like that, like money in politics, there it is. Money in politics has corrupted Congress. And the proof is pretty obvious, right? So our framers gave us what they called a republic. By a republic, they meant a representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, they meant a government that would have a branch that would be, quote, dependent on the people alone. So here's their model of government: the people and the government. I do my own slides. Cool, that way that bounces like that, right? So the people and the government. But here's the problem. Our Congress has evolved a different dependence, a dependence on the funders, too. That is a different and conflicting dependence. And because it's a different and conflicting dependence, it is a corruption of the ideal that the government be dependent on the people alone. It is a corruption of that ideal. Now, as I've given these talks, what I've found is we get it. People get it. There's nothing to teach here. The poll we did at the end of last year, we found that 96% of Americans, 96% believe we need to reduce the influence of money in politics. But the very next question we asked in that poll is, I think, the most telling. We then asked, how likely do you think it is that the influence of money in politics will be reduced? 91% said it was not likely. So 96% want it, but 91% don't believe it's going to happen. That produces the politics of resignation. We know what we want, but we accept what we can't have. So at least 96% of us wish we could fly like Superman, but because 91% of us are pretty convinced we can't, we don't leap off of tall buildings regularly, right? We accept our reality. But this is our great opportunity. Because if we can give people hope, as Harvey Milk used to say, give them hope that there is a way to fix this, you can unleash extraordinary energy to do something about it. And over the past 6 months, I've been involved in projects that have tried to give people hope. So the first of these happened in New Hampshire. There's a group called the New Hampshire Rebellion, which is not rebelling against government, but rebelling against the politicians who are refusing to address this issue. They want to ask every presidential candidate at every single event, how are you going to address the system of corruption in Washington? The New Hampshire Rebellion is inspired in part by this incredible woman, Doris Haddock, a.k.a. Granny D, who on January 1st, 1999, began a walk from L.A. to Washington, D.C., with a sign on her chest that said, Campaign Finance Reform. Took her 13 months to cross 3,200 miles. She arrived at the age of 90. When she came into Washington, there were hundreds of people with her, a bunch of congressmen who had gotten in cars and driven out about a mile out to meet her and walked in with her. But it was an incredible event, a celebration of the incredible contribution she had made to this campaign. She came from New Hampshire. So she inspired me. And on October 30th last year, I put a blog post up and I said, you want to help us organize a New Hampshire march in January? So we said we were going to march 185 miles across New Hampshire. Did I tell you it was in January? In January. From Dixville Notch, where the New Hampshire primary begins, all the way down to Nashua. Rick was with us at the end as he walked with us to the close. And this was, for me, a religious experience. Because when we announced this, I expected there to be like 5 people who would do it, 5 crazy people. I'd be one of the crazies. There'd be 4 other, at least, crazies who read my blog. But by the end, there were more than 200 people who participated. 25 of us did every single mile in January. Did I tell you that? It was in January. But what we found is as we crossed the state and told people about this idea and about the chance to do something about it, it unleashed an incredible passion. People were screaming, running out in their pajamas, honking their horns, putting signs in their front yard, because they're so desperate, conservatives and liberals alike, for something to get their democracy back. We give them hope. And it unleashes extraordinary energy. And one of the people marching, I think he just marched in here, Kai Newkirk, has now organized a march that has begun already from LA to Sacramento. I'm going to be walking with him tomorrow on my birthday for the very same end, organizing people here to the same cause of trying to bring people out through Granny D's technique. Of course, Gandhi and Martin Luther King did it before she did, but okay. Granny D's technique of marching to celebrate this capacity. That's number 1. Okay, here's number 2. This year at TED, I announced a different strategy called something called the May 1. On May 1, we would launch what we call the Mayday Pack. You know, Mayday as in distress signal. The idea of the Mayday Pack was that we were calling a Mayday on this democracy. And we were going to launch what we call a super PAC to end all super PACs. A couple years ago, we had commissioned a study. It said basically, how much would it cost to win a Congress committed to fundamental reform in 2016? What's that number? You know, and we hired somebody to go district by district to calculate. And then when they gave us the number, they said the most important thing, though, is to run a campaign in 2014 that kind of draws a line in the sand. Take 5 people out and show that you've got a big movement behind this idea so that in 2016, you terrify a bunch of Congress people and you can build a big enough movement to win. So we said we'd run a campaign to do that, and we would kickstart the campaign. Sort of. You can't kickstart because Kickstarter doesn't do politics, but kickstart in the sense of raise the money contingently. So we would set a goal, and if we didn't meet the goal, no money was collected. And we'd kickstart from the bottom, and we'd get that match from the top so that on Election Day in 2016, we would be able to win a Congress committed to fundamental reform in the way campaigns are funded. So 2 stages, 2014, 2016. In 2014, we wanted $12 million to fund these 5 races. So I said we'd try to raise $1 million in 30 days. And if we did that, we would get it matched. And then we'd run $5 million in 30 days. And if we did that, we'd get that matched. And then we'd run campaigns in 5 districts and win in those 5 districts and set the foundation for 2016. And in 2016, we would spend, I'm not allowed to tell you how much we would spend yet. It's kind of too crazy to even mention right now. But, we'd spend a lot of money to get our government back. So we launched it on May 1st. 1.5 days into it, we had raised $300,000. Then our servers melted, and a credible team, SWAT team of volunteers appeared and worked 24/7 through the weekend, and we rebuilt the servers. And on day 13, we crossed the $1 million mark. 13, 2 weeks ahead. And then last week, I announced that was matched. So on June 4th, we launched a second campaign of $5 million in 30 days, which then will be matched so that on July 4th, or this way, we could say Independence Day, we can declare independence and launch the campaign to begin that fight. Now, what explains these people? Yes, thank you. There's one of them. What explains these people pulling out their credit card and pledging to a website. They had no promotion. It was just a website and a blog and some tweets and emails among friends. What explains it? And what explains it is this same idea. We'd given people hope. We'd given them a strategy they could focus on, a way to think about what we could do, and we brought out an incredible amount of passion, which we now hope will manifest itself in something much bigger over the next month. Okay, finally. You two right here, the project that Bill has organized, this is a project to give people hope. This project here, the Citizens Congress, is a project to give people hope. Because like a convention, this project is outside of ordinary government. Congress doesn't control Bill. I'm pretty sure, right? Yeah. Congress doesn't control Bill. And like our Constitution, the Citizens Convention will rest not upon politicians or not upon wannabe politicians. The authority of that convention will rest upon people, upon the citizens, people who want to take responsibility for their government and to fix it. Now, how might that succeed? Here's my controversial suggestion. The Chatterati in America think the interesting division in American politics is between the left side and the right side. I think the interesting division in American politics is between the inside and the outside. The inside, the people who live within the beltway of Washington, D.C., and the outside, the rest of the United States. And when you listen to what they talk about in the inside and compare it to what people think on the outside, we can remix John Gray's famous book here. D.C. is from Mars, and we are from Earth. So this inside and outside suggests a certain kind of politics. And the outsiders, we could say, are engaged in exopolitics, following Nigel Cameron. We are the exopoliticians. But the problem right now with exopolitics is that it is polarized. Like everyone, politicians, political parties, the media, the .orgs, they all practice this business model of polarization. The more we hate, the more they profit. Indeed, they depend upon making us hate each other so that they can profit. And our challenge, and I suggest the challenge of what Bill has started here, is to embrace a certain kind of discipline. The discipline to be able to bracket the polarizing and push it to one side. The discipline practiced by you to focus on what is common ground here, a common enemy here, and that is this corruption. Now, this is hard. It's incredibly hard for us because all of our instincts are against it. But there's inspiration, I think, in our past, and the inspiration is here. People look at those men and they say, you know, bunch of white male property owners. What's the diversity in that? But the diversity there was profound. Because, of course, there were people in that group who owned slaves and believed in slavery, and there were people in that group who believed slavery was the moral abomination of the age, and people in that group, like Mason, who both owned slaves and thought slavery was the moral abomination of the age. They were deeply divided on the most important issue they could have been divided about. Now, none of the issues that we face today, I think, are as difficult, as profoundly difficult as that one issue. And yet they could work through that, and maybe that was a mistake, but they worked through that to create a government that could eventually create the republic that we've had. And so too do I think you can be focused on the problem in America, which is not that we have too many Republicans or too many Democrats. The problem in America is that government can't work. Government is being held hostage by the funders, the Lesters, the Sheldons, by the people who fund campaigns. And a conversation focused so that different souls can stay focused on this fundamental issue gives us all hope in this process. Now, one final plea. I mentioned Article 5 at the beginning and the convention at the beginning, because as some of you know, there's a big push around the country to get an Article 5 convention. Probably 26 states have now passed resolutions. Vermont was the first state to pass a resolution focused on the issue of money in politics. Illinois just passed it out of the Committee on the Judiciary, and California is considering it right now around the issue of money in politics. I support these movements. But my hope is that those movements can be complemented by the kind of work that you will be doing here, by citizens, by proceedings like these, because my fear is that the conventions become conventions of politicians, not of citizens. And at a minimum, as you work here to claim your voice, sensible voice about what the future of our government should look like, you should also fight to keep that voice relevant in this process, including the process of calling for an Article 5 convention. There is no reason why citizens can't be part of that process, and every reason why they must. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Professor Lessig. The remaining speakers will have 5 minutes each. Just kidding. Ladies and gentlemen, Hedrick Smith.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the university for having me here. Thank you, Bill Ostrander, for inviting me to your Citizens Congress. Thank you, Larry Lessig, for a sensational speech. And thank you all for coming, because you care. It's amazing to listen to Larry and to think about how each of us goes about talking about this issue in different ways and yet striking so many common themes. I wish I could be lighthearted about why we're here tonight. It reminds me of that cartoon in Peanuts, the one where Lucy has a card table set up in the backyard. It says psychiatry 1 cent. And Charlie Brown comes up, as you might expect, and puts his penny down, wants psychiatric help from Lucy. She says, Charlie, before I can give you advice, I need you to think of life as a voyage on a great ocean liner. Now, there's some people, and they take their deck chairs up into the bow, and they look into the future to see where they're going. And there are other people, and they take their deck chair to the stern to look back to see where they've come from. Which group do you belong to? And Charlie scratched his head for a moment. He said, Lucy, I'm having trouble getting my chair unfolded. That's our picture of Washington today. That's our picture of Washington today. But I wish I could be lighthearted about it. We're not here tonight to talk about campaign reform. We're here tonight to talk about American democracy. Our democracy is in peril. We have a system of government that's been corrupted by money. It's awash with money. By a system of gerrymandered political districts that favor extreme candidates and marginalize and disenfranchise the moderates. We have a system that, as Larry was pointing out, was built on the fundamental basic idea of consent of the government. And we now have a government that is beholden to the few and not to the governed. Talk to any group of people around the country, and as Larry said, people get it. I've given dozens of speeches around the country. People are not only giving the politicians bad ratings, they're not only rating Congress and the president and the media and the lawyers and lots of others, the lobbyists, as low as they ever have. They now have the lowest confidence in our political system as a system in 40 years. And one poll that I read recently said more than 60%, 62% of Americans now believe the United States is in decline. So we're not just talking about what we can do about tinkering with the system. We're talking about whether or not we can recover our country for ourselves and for itself. John Gardner, the man who helped found Common Cause and who served in Lyndon Johnson's cabinet, said at one point, and listen to the elegance and the eloquence of this: "We're walking the edge of a precipice here, the edge of a precipice. Civilizations die of disenchantment. If enough people lose faith in their society, the whole venture falls apart." We're not just talking about whether or not a bunch of people have too much power. They do. We're not talking about just whether or not a bunch of people have too much wealth. They do. We're talking about whether or not this thing is going to hold together. This thing we call American democracy is going to hold together. When I went to Oxford after Williams, I studied a famous British historian named Arnold Toynbee. Toynbee wrote The History of Human Civilization, 21 civilizations over 6,000 years. And he told the story of the rise and fall of human civilizations in terms of challenge and response. Could they cope with the environment? Could they cope with a foreign enemy? He has interesting stories about ancient Greece and the Inca civilization. What's interesting is when he starts talking about the two civilizations that we admire the most and think of ourselves as to compare ourselves with them, ancient Greece and ancient Rome, he says those civilizations fell into disrepair and began to decline because of what he called schisms in the soul of those societies, schisms in the body politic. That's what fractured Rome. That's what fractured ancient Greece. And when you think of America today, we're not one America. We're two Americas. We're an America divided by money. We're an America divided by power. We're in America, as Larry described and many others have as well, where Washington is disconnected from the country, where Wall Street is disconnected from Main Street. So as we talk about this issue of campaign reform, we're talking about something much more than just money. We're talking about whether or not we can gather ourselves, pull ourselves together, fit together, forge the kind of solidarity that has made this country great over our history. Everybody else in this business, as far as I can tell, talks about money in politics. I think it's much more fundamental than that. It is a money politics, one word. There's people power, there's citizens power, there's consent of the government, and then there's money politics. Money politics has driven a wedge between the people and Washington. Money politics has assured us policies that favor special interests. Money politics has generated crony capitalism and gridlock. Money politics has usurped the will of the people. That's where we are today. Now, we care about this issue not just because we care about our political system. We care about this issue because it touches us all. If you look at that list of 10 issues that was up on the screen just a little while ago, every single one of those issues is touched by and affected by and blocked by money politics. And what's interesting is it comes out of money. It comes out of the economic situation. The economic situation was both the creator and now the benefactor of the situation that we have. If you look back, when I began my career as a Washington correspondent in the early 1960s, when I covered civil rights in the South, we had a political system that worked. Yes, the parties disagreed, but they passed budgets. They sent a man to the moon. They stood up to the Soviet Union. They passed Medicare and Medicaid and the civil rights legislation. We had an economic system where wealth and prosperity was rather widely shared. If you look at the period from the end of World War II until the middle 1970s, the productivity of the American workforce, the engine that drives growth and a rising living standard, rose 97%. And if you look at the median household income, it rose 95%. The growth, the prosperity, the profits of the corporations in this country and the efficiency of our economic machine were passed around to the country as a whole. The middle class shared in that. We've lost that middle. We've lost that sharing. But why did we have it? We had it for a couple of reasons. We had it because we actually had business leaders who believed in sharing power and sharing wealth. They thought it was smart business and smart economics. But we also had it, and listen to this, because we had a very active and engaged middle class in America. If you go back to the 1960s, we had the civil rights movement. If you go back to the 60s and 70s, we had a women's movement that said it was unfair for women to be making 41 cents on the dollar when men were making a buck. We had a consumer movement led by Ralph Nader, unsafe at any speed, said Detroit was creating cars that were causing accidents, that were killing people. And where are we today? Consumers movement. We had an environmental movement. Think of this now. We had an environmental movement that on Earth Day 1970, April 22nd, 20 million Americans marched in the streets. They were in shopping malls, on university campuses, on the mall in D.C., at state capitals. They were having talkathons on radio and television. People were engaged. People were engaged. There was a peace movement. There was a strong labor movement. People all across this country on issue after issue were involved in making sure that government was responsive to them. So this thing we're talking about and all those issues that Larry just so eloquently laid out to you are connected to a people that have a past of engagement and effective response. I remember talking with Bill Ruckelshaus, who was the first head of the Environmental Protection Agency under Richard Nixon, appointed by a Republican pro-business president. I remember asking him at one point, after the civil rights, after the environmental protests of Earth Day, within a year, Congress had passed 7 major pieces of environmental legislation: the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Anti-Toxic Substances Act. And all of them were signed by that great pro-business Republican president, Richard Nixon. Well, not all of them. Richard Nixon didn't sign the Clean Air Act. So I asked Ruckelshaus, what's going on? Is Nixon a closet greenie? He said, oh. He said, no. He said, don't worry about that. He said, in all the years I worked for Nixon, he never once asked me, is it really bad out there? Is it really true that Cuyahoga River is bursting into flame because of all the chemicals being dumped into the river? Is it really true the slime is so bad on the Potomac River that if you put your hand in, it comes out covered with green slime? Is it really that bad? He said, he never asked me once, but he did tell me not to get captured by the bureaucrats over at the EPA. I said, well, then why did he do it, Bill? Why did he sign that legislation? He said, the people demanded it, and we in the government had to respond. That's the way democracy is supposed to work. We have to remember that not that long ago, in our own past, we as a people demanded that Washington respond, not just on campaign finance, but on a slew of issues. And we had a tax system that redistributed wealth. We had a social welfare net, safety net that protected people. We had a social compact that shared the wealth. There were a lot of things that went on in that earlier era. And if you look forward and jump forward to the last 30 years or so, productivity went up 80%, median household income went up 10%. If you look at the period from 1979 to 2011, 84% of the entire growth in the nation's income went to the top 1%. Not just liberal economists, but Citigroup said we have the greatest inequality of wealth of any major economic power since 16th century Spain. That's 500 years. And now what's going on? All that money is coming spilling into our political system. And what's it doing? It's trying to protect all that money that is now concentrated at the top of our society. And when you start to see what's happened to the political system, you understand that it relates to what's happening to the rest of us in the economic system. So there's a connection. Take a look at any of those issues on that list. Is your number one issue climate change? Is your number one issue national debt? Is your number one issue a livable wage or student debt? Social Security or Medicare? Loss of jobs overseas? A more competitive America? Any issue. We can't get to that issue because the system is gridlocked. The government is captured. As Larry said, the study by Marty Gillens and others at Princeton literally demonstrated statistically that our voice is not being heard, and the voice of the financial and economic elite is. And one of the great reasons is the concentration of both economic power and the economic power moving into the political system. It's interesting to see what politicians themselves have to say. It's not just those of us on the outside who understand the degree to which our system has been captured. John McCain, Republican candidate for president, said, "The two political parties are, quote, selling the country to the highest bidder." They can't do the people's business. I know a fellow named Fritz Hollings, who was a senator from South Carolina. I happen to come from South Carolina. My family home was there. Fritz told me that in 1973, the limit on spending for a Senate race in South Carolina was $687,000. By the 1990s, it had become $8.5 million. Hollings told me that in order to run his re-election campaign, he had to raise $30,000 a week for every week of the 6 years he was in office. That is as much money as 90 million Americans live on, $30,000 a year. That's what he was doing for 6 years. John Kerry talks about the system being corrupted. Larry uses the word corruption. He says the system's corrupted. It isn't just the individuals. And listen to this. The unending chase for money, I believe, threatens to steal our democracy itself. The alliance of money and the interests that it represents is steadily silencing the voice of the vast majority of Americans. And catch this. The insidious intention of that money is to set the agenda, change the agenda, block the agenda, define the agenda of Washington. Louis Brandeis said a century ago, we must make our choice. We may either have democracy or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. And what we're seeing now is the impact of that concentrated wealth. Now, doing something about it is the challenge. Doing something about it is the challenge. And the truth is, people do understand. Certainly since Citizens United and the McCutcheon decisions, people get it. People don't have to be persuaded there's a problem. 89% of the people in a Gallup poll said some kind of reform has to be taken care of, has to be carried out. But people are not engaged. And the question is, how do we engage Americans? Talking with a friend of mine who was one of the great organizers in the Southwest, he said to me at one point, Rick, you know, they have a saying, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, powerlessness also corrupts. It corrupts democracy at the core. Think about that. If we feel powerless, we will not change it. And certainly it's not going to change from the inside. What encourages me is that there are people like Larry at work, but also if today you look across the horizon, the landscape in political America, in this state and in Washington state, there are petitions now being circulated to put the issue of a constitutional amendment to roll back Citizens United on the ballot this fall. If you go to Illinois, they're circulating petitions to put on the ballot this fall in Illinois gerrymander reform that will stop the crooked gerrymandering of the districts there. If you go to New Hampshire, the legislation in New Hampshire has just passed a bill to get disclosure of political funding. Not all funding, not as good a bill as it could be, but a great step forward. You know, if you go to Florida, there's a case being argued in a Florida court right now that says the gerrymandering of the Florida congressional districts in the last election by the governor and by the legislature was crooked and broke the fair elections law in Florida, and it has to be reversed in time for this year's election. And that's going on in Virginia. Part of the problem is most of us don't know what's going on beyond our landscape, beyond our community. There's a lot more going on. There's ferment alive in this country. But the critical thing is to understand that we can do it. It's not just the raising of the money. It's not just the $1 million, which is important, and that is important. It's not just the $5 million. It is the notion that we can do it. If you go back and look at American history, and not that long ago, we were doing it. I remember hearing Martin Luther King being there at the March on Washington on August 28, 1963. One of the most moving days of my life, one of the greatest days for me as a citizen as well as a reporter. It was a festival of democracy. But more importantly than remembering Martin Luther King at the pinnacle of his career, standing before that great hall of democracy, the Lincoln Memorial, saying those anguished words about having a dream, saying also we have come here to cash a promissory note from American democracy, was to have met Martin Luther King when he was lying on the ground in his coveralls in front of the City Hall in Albany, Georgia, beginning of a protest. Leaders don't come full-blown. They don't start standing at the Lincoln Memorial. They start sitting on the ground. They start here in San Luis Obispo. They start on marches through New Hampshire. They start in very simple places. We have a picture that somehow we have to become leaders and we have to have a successful movement from the day it's born. No, we have to build it, stitch it together, and build it the same way you would raise a house. I remember traveling with Martin Luther King through the South, to Birmingham, Alabama, to Jackson, to Gadsden, to Albany, Georgia, and a whole lot of trouble spots. Martin Luther King was not a hero at that point. He was not well liked in the South. He was roundly condemned. The people in the South who ran the power system, not unlike the people who run the power system in Washington today, they condemned Martin Luther King. They called him an outside agitator. An outside agitator. It was almost like calling somebody a communist. He's not from our hometown. What's he doing coming into Birmingham? What's he doing coming into Albany, Georgia? He's an outside agitator. All the other civil rights leaders I'd met before Martin Luther King shrank from that epithet. And Martin Luther King seized on it. He said, yes. He said, I am an outside agitator. He said, think of your washing machine. What is there in your washing machine? There's an agitator. There's an agitator right at the center of your washing machine. And it is stirring up the water and knocking the dirt and the filth out of your clothes. And that's what I'm trying to do to this society. Ladies and gentlemen, people in this room, people in any room like this in America, have to decide today we're going to become a new generation of agitators. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. That was fantastic. Well, we are delighted to have Trevor Potter, who made it to town. Mr. Potter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I apologize for sliding in a little bit late, but some of the vagaries of our nation's air service, I'm glad to be here at all. Delighted to be here with all of you. I thank you, Bill, for all you have done to put this evening together. And I've heard Larry speak before, so I know that you learned an enormous amount from him. Unfortunately, I heard most of Rick, so I know that I've got two people who are important leaders in this field to follow. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about what it is that I know the title of the conference is What Could Go Wrong, and I would like to talk about what has gone wrong and what we can do about it. There's a lot to say on this subject, but I'll try to hit the highlights. Let's start with the amount of money that we are seeing. It's really a tidal wave flowing into recent federal campaigns. In 2012, there was a total of $7 billion spent in federal elections, more than double the amount spent only a few years before in 2000. The amount of money in House and Senate races is up. The cost of the average Senate race was $20 million, double what it cost in 2002. 2012 saw a $29 million House race and an $85 million Senate race. Numbers that just boggle the mind. 2012 was also the first presidential election in more than 30 years in which neither candidate participated in the post-Watergate presidential public funding system. Instead, each raising and spending hundreds of millions of dollars that they had to raise themselves. A substantial portion of the huge jump in campaign spending is the result of what are called outside independent expenditures. We'll talk about how most of those terms are not true in a moment, which have multiplied in number and amount since the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United. There was $300 million in outside spending in 2008 and $1 billion in 2012. To make matters worse, the percentage of this $1 billion that was from secret sources, so-called dark money, grew to 40%, or $400 million in 2012, spent in key states for the presidential and Senate races. This secret spending is contrary to our bipartisan tradition of full disclosure of funds spent in elections, a tradition fully consistent with our constitutional norms, but now threatened by a wave of anonymous spending on both sides. Let me be clear that I do not believe the problem is the amount of money being spent itself. In general, in a democracy, more money spent on political speech, which informs the electorate about its choices, should be a good thing. However, that is not the case today. The first reason, as I have mentioned, is the growing proportion that comes from secret sources, so that voters cannot judge the motives behind political advertising, and spenders can threaten office holders with retribution for legislative actions without the public being aware of the corruption behind the screen. But there are other problems with the current flood of political money in our democracy. The first is, where does it all come from? As Professor Lessig has told you, it comes from a tiny, tiny minority of the American people. And why is this small minority giving so generously? Often because they want something from government or want to ensure they don't get something, like action from government. Rick Smith has explained this in detail. But if you go beyond it, it isn't just the small number of people who are giving, it is how the money is being raised. To say that members of Congress are in a constant fundraising cycle, one that requires enormous amounts of time, endless phone call, hours and hours every workday, weekends and nights, is merely to begin to state the problem. These are hours not spent doing what members of Congress are elected to do, and what they are paid to do, to work on legislation, attend committee hearings, talk with their colleagues, seek consensus, all of the things that might make Congress work. Instead, members spend hours during the week in call centers or at breakfast, cocktail, and dinner fundraisers with a small group of people willing to pay for their company because they want something from them. And those people are not constituents, but Washington lobbyists. On weekends, members travel to attractive locations on mountaintops or by the sea, selected for their appeal to donors, where they spend their time mingling with lobbyists or billionaires, again, rather than constituents. This disease has affected the presidential elections as well. The problem is evident when you compare two numbers, 9 and 222. In 1984, the year President Reagan was seeking re-election, he attended 9 fundraisers. And none of them were for his own campaign because it was publicly funded. They were for party committees. In 2012, when President Obama was running for re-election, he attended 222 fundraisers. The whole purpose of the presidential public system that we have now lost was to avoid this result, to allow the president to spend his or her time solving our nation's problems rather than precious time in office fundraising. Why is this happening, and how did we get to this point? How did we end up with $7 billion presidential elections flooded in secret money? One answer is the Supreme Court of the United States, now at war with the post-Watergate reforms and at war with Congress's attempts to deal with corruption and the appearance of corruption in federal campaign fundraising through the McCain-Feingold law. The case most notoriously associated with the Roberts Court's efforts to unravel campaign finance law is, of course, Citizens United, the 2010 case, a name now synonymous with corporate and undisclosed money in our elections. The court ruled that corporations have the same political speech rights as individuals, therefore allowing corporations, and now unions, to make unlimited independent expenditures and electioneering communications. I was one of the people who filed a brief in Citizens United urging the court not to do what they did. I could spend the next 3 hours talking about what's wrong with Citizens United, but let me just cite 3 of, I think, the most serious problems with that case. First, the court redefined the justification for allowing regulation of money in elections to be the prevention of actual quid pro quo corruption, effectively bribery, which is, of course, already illegal. What this means is that the majority of the court thinks that preventing the appearance of corruption by regulating the sources and amounts of money in federal elections violates the Constitution, that selling access to official meetings or showing gratitude to big donors is a legitimate part of the way government should operate. Second, the court mistakenly thought that the new big money they were unleashing would be fully disclosed. Justice Kennedy, writing for the majority, said, "A campaign finance system that pairs corporate independent expenditures with effective disclosure has not existed before today. But with the advent of the internet, prompt disclosure of expenditures can provide shareholders and citizens with the information needed to hold corporations and elected officials accountable for their positions and supporters." This sounds good. And the good news is that 8 out of 9 justices signed the part of the opinion stating that full disclosure of the sources of campaign funding is constitutional. The bad news is that Justice Kennedy was wrong in thinking that we would have this disclosure. Instead, secret money today is being funneled into elections through groups like 501c4s and C6s and other entities that do not disclose their donors to the public. The third problem with Citizens United is that the court made an unexamined and completely incorrect assumption about the independence of independent expenditures. The court's theory was that independent expenditures are not corrupting and therefore cannot be limited because they are wholly, completely, totally independent of candidates and political parties. But as we all know, in 2012, we had a Romney super PAC run by senior former Romney campaign aides and Romney met the top donors to the super PAC to thank them for giving. And we had an Obama super PAC, headed by 2 former White House officials and endorsed by the president publicly, with campaign officials sent to super PAC events. The problem here is the huge gap between the Supreme Court's definition of independent, wholly, totally, completely independent of parties and candidates, and the Federal Election Commission's very narrow definition of coordinating with a candidate, basically allowing candidates to do everything except edit super PAC ads. This is a critical issue because the court's whole constitutional theory of why outside expenditures cannot be limited by the government is that they are independent efforts, unconnected to a candidate or party, and therefore cannot corrupt. But they are often not independent. They become just another pocket in the candidate's or the political party's coat, and therefore can corrupt under the court's own theory. Now, that was Citizens United. Afterwards, the Roberts Court continued its destruction of our country's campaign finance laws in a case out of Arizona involving the public financing system in that state called McComish v. Bennett. The Supreme Court has, before this case, upheld the constitutionality of voluntary public funding systems. They were enacted at the presidential level after Watergate, and many cities and states have versions of that. However, in 2011, the Supreme Court invalidated the Arizona matching funds provision, which provided additional public funding to publicly financed candidates when they faced big spending, privately financed opponents or opposition groups. Charles Freed, who was Ronald Reagan's Solicitor General, filed a brief in the Supreme Court in the Arizona case arguing that these additional funds provided just what the court should welcome: additional speech in elections, so that voters can hear both sides of issues and have more information about candidates and their positions. However, in an Alice in Wonderland holding, the majority essentially said that enabling additional speech might deter big spenders from speaking in the first place, because they would know that they could not drown out the other candidate, and that the threat of such additional speech therefore might chill speech. Heaven forbid that these virtually unlimited private funds for political speech might be answered by candidates in a public funding system. Finally, most recently, a month ago, in McCutcheon v. FEC, the court struck down the aggregate contribution limits for contributions to candidates and political parties. Without the aggregate limits, joint fundraising committees comprised of candidates and parties will now be able to collect checks of millions of dollars. The court found no problem with the specter that party committees could sell access to congressional leaders or sell meetings to discuss legislation. This is appropriate, they said. It's not corrupting. And all of this to increase the political power of the handful of Americans who can afford to give such sums. In 2012, only 644 Americans hit the aggregate limit that the court found was too low. The direction the 5 justices and the majority on the Supreme Court are driving is, to me, frightening. To recap, they place the highest constitutional value on unlimited spending in elections by those with virtually unlimited money to spend. They have narrowed the definition of corruption and the appearance of corruption to the point where actions short of actual bribery are now permissible. They have spoken in favor of full disclosure of the sources of election funding, but have given us a status quo of $400 million in dark money and rising. They have stated that all of this so-called outside activity is not corrupting and therefore cannot be limited by government, despite evidence that it is not, in fact, independent and that it is corrupting our legislative and judicial systems. They have made it more difficult to create alternative public funding systems for candidates and signaled that such systems will be constitutionally suspect if they appear to penalize non-participants by making public funding workable or appealing. So this brings us to the next question. Where do we go from here? How does our democracy deal with these challenges? This is the moment when we have to stop and think about basic American values, the values that make a democracy work. There is a historic danger of allowing a small subset of our society to control elections and thus government, whether it's an aristocracy back in colonial times or a couple of hundred of the richest Americans in a country of 340 million. Citizens are willing to respect the legitimacy of a government they believe is transparent and acting in the national interest, but they will mistrust decisions of a government they see as captured by narrow special interests bent on self-enrichment. We need a system that allows for full participation, including the ability to communicate and have our voices heard for all citizens. And we need a system in which members of Congress are responsive to the people they represent. Former Justice John Paul Stevens has spoken recently about this fundamental principle of our democracy, saying, quote, "Rules limiting campaign contributions and expenditures should recognize the distinction between money provided by their constituents and money provided by non-voters, such as corporations and people living in other jurisdictions." Justice Breyer's dissent in the McCutcheon case addresses this same idea. He said that part of the interest protected by the First Amendment is the ability of citizens to speak and to be heard by their representatives. In our current system, the voices of voters are drowned out because members are listening to, indeed spending most of their time with, big money donors instead of voters. Finally, we need to take another look at what sort of rules on money in politics are appropriate, even necessary, to protect our democratic system of government. As former Justice Stevens has said, the court got it wrong on corruption. Quote, "For years, the court's campaign finance jurisprudence has been incorrectly predicated on the assumption that avoiding corruption or the appearance of corruption is the only justification for regulating campaign speech and the financing of political campaigns. It is wrong to assume that preventing corruption is the only justification for laws limiting the First Amendment rights of candidates and their supporters. Elections are contests between rival candidates for public office. Like rules that govern athletic contests or adversary litigation, those rules should create a level playing field. The current system does not create a level playing field, but a playing field drastically tilted in favor of those with large amounts of money to buy speech. A book just out quotes President Obama as saying at a closed fundraiser in 2012 to a room full of millionaires and billionaires, quote, "You now have the potential of 200 people deciding who ends up being elected president every single time." The good news, after all of this bad news that I've just given you, is that there are solutions to these problems, and as evidenced by this crowd, there is citizen interest in changing our broken system. Some of the ideas worth spending time and effort are the May Day PAC, Professor Lessig's imaginative idea of raising money to defeat members of Congress who oppose reform and elect members who would make it happen. A constitutional amendment, recently endorsed by former Justice Stevens, to allow Congress and states to place reasonable limits on campaign funding. Public financing. We need to provide an effective alternative to the current system of financing candidates, so that those who want to avoid being indebted to special interests can still compete in elections. There are models out there that work, like New York City's program, where small private donations are matched 5-to-1 out of city funds. This sends candidates out to raise money from average citizens rather than concentrating just on the wealthy few. Another funding idea is in a proposal called the American Anti-Corruption Act, which I helped draft. It would give every registered voter a $100 tax rebate, a credit or voucher of their own money back, which they could give to any candidate or party of their choice, so that citizens have a much greater say in how the rest of their tax money is spent by government. The American Anti-Corruption Act also proposes breaking the current connection between lobbyists and campaigns by saying that members of Congress cannot accept contributions or fundraising help from lobbyists who lobby them, and members and congressional staffers cannot go to work for lobbying firms and companies that employ lobbyists for a long cooling-off period after leaving Congress. We can insist that Congress require full disclosure of all the sources of funds spent in elections, and that the FEC require that independent expenditures be truly independent of candidates and political parties. Speaking of the FEC, my former agency, we need to free it of its current 3-3 partisan deadlocks, which keep it from doing its job. We need commissioners who will work on a bipartisan basis to enforce the law, or a new FEC structure. All of these ideas are out there, they are doable, and they all would make a significant difference. And there are undoubtedly others. What we need is the courage, the strength, to go out and make some of this happen. So we have much work to do. Work building a better understanding of the First Amendment, of the way our founders hoped democracy would work with full citizen participation. We need to work mobilizing citizens to convince Congress that we care about these issues, and ultimately to again reform our campaign finance system. Time is running out. We need to start now, and gatherings of interested and engaged citizens such as this are the start. Thanks very much.
I'd like to thank everyone. First, we are going beyond our extended time, but we do have one final speaker, William Ostrander of Citizens Congress.
If you stay, I've got some pretty cool slides that I found that are kind of attractive, so if you can be patient with us a second. I want to thank Professor Latner for moderating, and these three fine gentlemen. I am so in awe of you guys for doing what you do and for coming out here and spending time with us. This is their personal time. These gentlemen are not being paid. That's amazing. I got a standing ovation. I haven't even started yet. That's fantastic. Well, we're all now really informed. But most of us in this room don't have the amazing credentials that these gentlemen have. But that doesn't excuse us from playing our part. So what are we going to do? That's the question here. In my line of work, when my cows get out, oh good, it worked. It doesn't do much good just to stand around and talk about my belief in strong fences. In my opinion, America's metaphorical cows are out. So what are we going to do to put the cows back where they belong? Now, the first thing that I'm going to suggest to you doesn't require you to even lift a finger. It's language. In 1986, President Reagan uttered one of his most famous lines. Perhaps you recall this. The 9 most terrifying words to me in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Well, President Reagan was clearly addressing his disdain for what he perceived as unnecessary and overzealous government intrusion. But the larger impact of the statement was in using the definitive article of the, T-H-E, calling it the government. Reagan dismisses our ownership stake in of, for, and by the people and popularized the idea of government as an us versus them relationship. Right? How many of you people describe your family with the word the? Now, we may not be blood related, but you are all my family as far as I'm concerned. So when we're talking about the government, we're doing ourselves a disservice. That mindset has distanced us from our democracy and releases us from responsibility. So consider how the United States is framed in the preamble of our Constitution. Whoops, there's my family. We, the people, form a more perfect union, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to do tonight is change the vernacular of the government to the possessive pronoun of our government. Now, believe it or not, that simple change of phrase will literally connect new neural pathways in your brain. It's true. If you describe my car versus the rental car, how do you feel about it? It literally does have a different neural pathway in your brain. So I'm asking you tonight to try saying it once and see how it feels. Our government. It feels different than saying the government, doesn't it? That's not always easy to claim when policies go against what we believe. Now, I don't always agree or even like what my brother says sometimes, but because he is my family, I won't disown him. If we want to reclaim our government, we first have to accept ownership. The second thing I'm going to suggest to you tonight requires some crazy. The issue of money in politics needs to have a national galvanizing event. We need to demonstrate our commitment to changing the rules, because that's what this is. Essentially, it's a rule change, folks. Not another electronic petition that makes us feel like we've really just expressed ourselves. Electronic petitions have some value, but they are as helpful to legislators as about as much time as it took for you to push that click button. So what I'm talking about is a big idea, a Hands Across America, a 1,000,000-man march, a tractorcade. How many remembers that? I did. I come from the farm. And on 3,000 guys driving tractors in Washington, D.C. was pretty impressive to me. Or how about getting all Americans to wear pink? You can't see a pink sock on a football player in the youth football league here without going, breast cancer awareness, right? So we need a big national idea. And tonight, for example, we are flattered to have such an idea in attendance in a group called 99 Rise. This gentleman right here, Kai Newkirk, and his 3 companions, please stand up. 99 Rise have organized a 480-mile march. from March for Democracy from Los Angeles to Sacramento to tell our representatives to end corruption. And I applaud you for doing that. This is what they're doing. Professor Lessig has walked 185 miles with people across New Hampshire in the, what month was that again, Professor Lessig? The balmy month of January, I think it was, across New Hampshire, called the New Hampshire Rebellion. What you need to understand is although these may seem like strange things to do, physical actions like that capture the imagination and the attention of others. When you witness an action, you can't help but reflect on your position on the issue. This got our attention 25 years ago. Even when you witness it today, it causes you to reflect on how you feel about standing up to power. It was actually 25 years ago this week. My idea will be an event called No Money Day. Now, what's more fun than no money? Seriously, my idea of No Money Day is that if you disagree with money in politics, that all across the country, you, me, and all who are willing, take a single day off from your job and do volunteer work in your community. Perhaps on election day. Just for a day, demonstrate with your friends and family and express your frustration that we do not agree with business as usual in our governance. Right? We will not participate. If money is equal to free speech, as the Supreme Court opined, then surely our absence at work that day says something. If money is equal to free speech, then what is the value of a monastic vow of silence on election day? Now, by the way, I'm not talking about not voting. Of course, I'm not advocating that. But just for a day, symbolically, to be silent, to represent how you feel about how your elections are running. Kind of an interesting idea for me. Kai, was walking 480 miles across the San Joaquin Valley in the middle of June kind of a crazy idea? Yeah. Professor Lessig, was walking 185 miles in the dead of a New Hampshire winter crazy? Were Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, Martin Luther King, or Cesar Chavez crazy? Were our veterans who gave, as Lincoln wrote in the Gettysburg Address, their last true measure of devotion crazy? Were the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence crazy to sign a document breaking ties with the world's most powerful military? If we desire, as the Constitution says, to form a more perfect union, then just being a little crazy might be the thing that we need. No Money Day is my idea. What is yours? The second thing that you can do when you leave here tonight is to come up with a big idea that grabs the attention and asks the vast majority of Americans to reflect on whether or not you believe that the systemic corruptive influence of money in Washington needs to change. And you know what? I think they'll say yes. So go to our website and tell us your idea. Or tell me if you would be willing to participate in an event like No Money Day. Be crazy. I dare you. Be crazy. And number 3, attend the Citizens Congress right here in San Luis Obispo and help create a national strategy to change the rules. Why the Citizens Congress? Why us? How can we have any impact on federal lawmaking? Well, I believe that one day when we start joining the possessive pronoun of our with government, our government, and desire to stand up and join the debate as average citizens may not seem like such a quixotic notion as columnist Leonard Pitts wrote about us, but merely a healthy democratic reflex. Now, less than a year ago, our group, I'm sorry I'm so uncoordinated with this thing, I never did it before. Less than a year ago, our group, consisting of teachers, CPAs, I'm a farmer, nurse, hairstylist, graphic designers, optometrists, etc., we decided that we could play a part in the national effort of reform. But how? Talking to our local officials was important, but, you know, it felt like we were pushing rope. Getting polite form letters of empathy about our issue from a DC intern was incredibly dismissive and frustrating. We decided to look at what the roadblocks were between our frustrations and our expectations. And it was really, really simple. You're going to be pleased about this, because here's what we found in a nutshell. 535 legislators, 2 houses of Congress, 158 pieces of proposed legislation, 11 constitutional amendments, national conventions, state conventions, 93 nonprofits, public financing of elections, legislation not yet submitted to Congress, gerrymandering, FEC, SEC, IRS rule changes, the Supreme Court, the First Amendment, dark money, disclosure bills, limits on candidate contributions but not in aggregate amounts, free speech, money equals speech. Oh my God, it seems insurmountable, right? When you think about this problem, do you go, where do I start? But then if you're like me, you actually say to yourself, hold on a minute, why am I doing this? This is the province of our congressmen and women and senators, and they know we're upset by this, so surely they'll correct the problem. Right? No. Unfortunately, since the widely panned Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court 4.5 years ago, our representatives in Congress, meaning the combined House and Senate, have spent 9,000 hours in session, proposed over 20,000 bills, and passed 2,445 of them. I'm not sure our issue is a priority. So despite overwhelming disagreement with the Supreme Court by people all across the country, inequality and dysfunctional politics not only still exist, but have gotten worse. In the present 113th Congress, there are 158 bills that have something to do with our election system. Now, that's a start. However, statistically speaking, any one of those bills only has an 8% chance of passing. With the exception of the Senator Bernie Sanders' proposal of a constitutional amendment, which is set for a floor vote in August, most of these bills will never even come to a vote in either congressional chamber. This suggests that reform is not a priority amongst our legislative bodies. So wanting to find out why this gap between the public's desire and the legislative apathy existed, I made 3 trips to Washington. And I personally visited 65 offices in the House and Senate. The feedback that I received ranged from, we support this issue, to, no, we're pretty happy with the way things are. One congressman's aide actually asked me what was in it for her boss. I was stunned. Literally, she said to me, I had to catch myself before I called her out on the carpet for what a stupid thing that was to say to me. On my 3rd trip, I had the chance to give a congressional briefing on the issue with Mr. Potter. What was clear from those meetings was that even those representatives who support reform, many were not sure of the best ideas to correct the situation. And with a small exception, one party has little or no platform interest in changing the status quo at all. And by the way, I don't have my law license, but I thought I would share with you that I did argue before the Supreme Court. Thank you. I've debated whether putting that in, and I had to ask my girlfriend whether that was tasteful or not. She said do it, so I did. Our Citizens Congress group also wanted to know more about what other citizen advocacy groups were doing. And so we identified 93 organizations dedicated all or in part to campaign finance reform or reversing Citizens United. I visited more than a few in Washington, D.C. and in New York. And we spoke to most of them. Particularly, there's a gal back here who I shouldn't name, but she's probably made close to 1,000 calls to Washington, D.C. over this period of the last 8 months. She's amazing. And we spoke to most of them, as I said. I even went, there I am traveling in the upper decker of a bus. I even went to Burlington, Vermont. And I spoke to Ben Cohen of Ben Cohen's ice cream fame, Ben Jerry's ice cream fame. For some reason, he didn't have an address on his office, which made it really hard to find, especially when I didn't have an appointment. But he, too, is an advocate of removing money from politics. Although I recognize there is a plural approach to reform, there did not appear to be significant collusion amongst the nonprofits, and there was an obvious desire to protect for some of them, their proprietary interests. In my opinion, in addition to the problem of reform, we had a problem with the reformers themselves. But before all of you get too smugly cynical, along the way I also found nearly every citizen I talked to believe reform is needed. And I probably stand corrected by Professor Lessig, who said there's something like 26 states now. So this is wrong. The point is it's growing, and there's a lot of people out there that are concerned about this. The fact that you've all shown up tonight is evidence of that. We also have people in both houses of Congress that are actually interested in doing something about that. and they encourage us to keep pushing back. The Citizens Congress was then conceived to help cut through the maze and cacophony and facilitate a dialogue between the reformers. We need a national strategy. This is cows being herded. It kind of fits my earlier metaphor here. We need a focus that strips away the extraneous and gives citizens a specific target to push. We need to be able to answer the common questions with a clearly defined goal or goals. It must be a focus that can be easily understood and employed by the public to rally on. We do it with natural catastrophes all the time. Our Citizens Congress starts tonight. You are invited to join us tomorrow morning at the Cliffs Resort down in Shell Beach to help create the focus. And I will show you how a bunch of concerned local citizens can make a difference at the national level. It's about do. So please join us. We need your help to get the cows back in the pen. And I want to thank first Cal Poly and Dean of Cal Poly College of Liberal Arts, Doug Epperson, for co-sponsoring this event. You were a pleasure to work with, Doug. Thank you. And as I said earlier, Professor Lessig, Mr. Smith, and Mr. Potter, again, these guys came on their own time. They're not being paid for this. I mean, if we only, all of us engage at the level they do, we wouldn't have this problem. So thank you for sharing with us and coming out here. Professor Latner, thank you for your kind moderation. And the entirely volunteer group of public citizens, dedicated souls that have helped the Citizens Congress to become real in less than a year. And to all of you who've come here tonight to reinvest in our government. Thank you.
All right, I would like to thank the audience for your patience and your listening skills. It's been a fantastic talk. For those of you who would like to stay, we would like to get your input. You can start making your contribution tonight, actually, not tomorrow. We have a series of questions, and remember that later on, the authors will be available to sign books outside.
Everyone, we're going to go through what we heard tonight in order. So Lawrence Lessig gave us 3 comments. We want you to take a look briefly at what's up here before you end up giving your feedback. Hedrick Smith gave us these 5 ideas prior to tonight's event. And so we're going to take a look at these one at a time on each of these, giving a 1 to 10 level of agreement or importance for each one. And then Trevor Potter had these 3 comments here. And then Bill had these 3 here. So what we want you to do is you consider these as, you can give them all a 10 if you want, but don't give them all a 10, all right? Show some discernment. We really want to see, what might stand out. Now, theoretically, if these are all good ideas, they should get a minimum of a 6, but we want to see if something pops up for you as a group on these concepts. Any questions at all before we go into these one at a time? I say grab your keypads again. Thank you for your patience on using your devices. The 10 is at the bottom in the middle. If you look closely, it says 10 in small yellow numbers. There is no 0 key. That is the Voldemort of keys. We do not speak that name. There is no 0. All right, here we go. First one's up. Again, try not to give them all a 10 unless you absolutely have to, all right? We're not going to force you to vote in any particular way, of course. First one is up. Now, this was a statement, and for the presenters, Lawrence, I believe this is pretty much a clear quote as to what you said. Is that accurate? Great. And so if you guys have any issues with these, we can go on and make a change as needed. All right, we're going to get our new end count for where we are right now. It looks like about 125, 130. Actually, way over that. Oh, only 1 keypad per person, too. If you have an extra keypad lying around, please. No lobbying the vote. Great. Actually, that's fantastic, guys. We're over 220 almost. Okay, last chance. All right, next. All right. If you have any question on the question, ask it while it's open. Of course, the folks who created these ideas are here. You can get clarity if you need it. Looks like everybody's pretty good on this. All right. Last chance. And next. And is that accurate, Lawrence, to a new era of change? Is that really the concept? Okay. All right, great focus, you guys. Good work. Last chance. And next. This begins the first of 5 that Hedrick gave us in advance of tonight. Okay, great. The suggestion is, do you guys want me to read the statement? Typically, I don't unless somebody really wants it. Yeah, typically I don't. But thanks for the suggestion, though. All right. Next. Someone else is reading it out loud. That's great. Okay. That's great. Great. All right, great job, you guys. Last chance. We're almost over 200. Just broke that. And next. We also had this set up to choose one out of the list of 5 that Hedrick presented as well, but just in spirit of time, we're not going to be doing that as a process. Last chance on this. Great job, you guys. And next. Now, we modified this. Hedrick gave this as $50 originally. Trevor offered it as $100, and so we just made the change, little editorial license there. Okay, last chance on this. And next. Okay, great focus, you guys. And just as a note, when you leave, make sure you drop the keypads off back where you got them. Okay, just when you leave. All right, excellent. And next. All right, last chance. And next. And the 3x3 is that currently there's 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans appointed to the FEC. All right, last chance. And next. Now we start off with Bill's first of his 3 ideas. All right, last chance. Next. And again, if you have any ideas for what this could be, please send those into the website for the Citizens Congress. All right, great job, you guys. I think you went through this in about, 4 or 5 minutes, something like that. Great work, you guys. Maybe a little less. Last chance. Here's the final one, the no money day. All right, and then here are our results. Excellent. Let's see if any of these really jump out. And so we get one that we call a consensus level. That's over a 90% level of importance and priority or agreement. One of them meets that standard. Now, as you can see, these are all really high. And so the ones that jump out are requiring full disclosure. We do have an agreement that things are really bad with the impacts that money and politics has had on our system. Again, very clear here, these 2. So from here up, these form a top tier, high levels of common ground and consensus. So just taking a quick look at this, I would say these 4 from the 14 that we voted on as a group do stand out from the rest, okay? Our government, and then this one as well. Now let's move down a bit and see what the next tier is. So as you can see, the second tier is these 4 right here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time so we can move on to your questions. And then let's move down. And as you can see, we have some that we don't agree on that strongly. This would be the final one that we have a high level of agreement. And now we're into, well, not so sure. This is diversity. That's the spread of the vote. 100% diversity. This is a percentage number. 100%, half give it a 1, half give it a 10. 0, we all give it the same number. This is the only one that we have high diversity on about a no money day, and it shows the spread of the vote. Okay? So let's just see if by gender, since we have that in there, the women are more interested in a no money day than others. I'm going to go by role real quickly. And so for our primary role, actually nobody really jumps out. The highest is academic, and that was a small N count as well. So again, overall, we can say as a group, 4 of these really jump out. We have a first tier after that, are these 4, and then we have this one right here. Is that clear to everybody? Okay, great. Excellent. I think we're going to go to Q&A right now, correct?
All right, we will now open up the conversation to the public. If you have a question, please be concise and brief, and we will line up in front of 2 of the microphones. And I will go from side to side. And please specify if you have a question for a specific guest or if your question is for the panel as a whole. All right, sir, go ahead.
I'll be brief because I have almost no voice left. What about the media? It seems that any of the ideas that you presented have a dependence upon communication among us and to us. What about reforming the media so that we get balanced information that we can make our own critical evaluations of?
Since I come from the media, I think probably it's my responsibility. First place, I would say that we in the media have failed largely over the last 20, 25 years to connect the dots. We collect the dots, we throw them at you, we don't connect the dots. Second thing I would say is that the media is captured by the Beltway. The media that dominates the national coverage of political issues and issues of political reform is housed in Washington. What I would do if I lived in this part of the country, I'd go beat on the Sacramento Bee and the Los Angeles Times, San Francisco Chronicle, whatever, and the television and radio media and say, get your reporters out here mixing with us in the country and find out what the people have to say. Because I can tell you, traveling the country, I find the same thing that Larry's reporting and that pollsters are reporting, that people in the country are way ahead of Washington on all these issues. And the Washington media is as much a part of the problem as the Washington politicians.
Thank you very much. Also, in the interest of full disclosure, if you could give your name, as Justice Scalia says, free speech is not for sissies.
Hi, my name is Gina Whitaker. This is an instinct I have, an instinct. I may make a fool of myself. This country is steeped in so many ways in racism. And I'd like to know if any of you have any comment on what are the intersections here? How can we get people of color involved in this kind of understanding? And I'd just like to hear what you have to say about that. Thank you.
Well, I'll try again. I go around and talk at a lot of colleges and universities. And I would say that a number of them, particularly state universities and state universities in the South, give me an opportunity to talk to ethnically and racially mixed audiences. And I would say I don't sense any difference. I'm not doing a statistical polling kind of thing that we just saw, 8.9 against 8.7, so I don't know that precisely. But I can tell you that when I was down at Georgia State or when I was at Virginia or several colleges in Florida, Northwestern, Missouri, Nebraska, I find no discernible difference among the young people racially or ethnically in terms of their concern about these issues. I mean, the young people are understandably concerned about student debt. They're concerned about whether or not they're going to get jobs. They're worried about jobs going overseas. They are waking up to the fact, some of them, that the political situation is going to affect their lives and the policies that are going to affect their lives. I have to be honest with you, as I've gotten into older audiences, they tend to look a little bit like this one, so that there's a real tilt that most of the audience is white. So I cannot tell you about adults, but certainly my reporting on other issues would lead me to believe that people of color are certainly as concerned about these issues. They're certainly concerned about whether or not the political system is taking care of them. You take a look at the immigration issue today, it can't get anywhere. Latinos are certainly frustrated by that, and they see the political system as captured, as caught, as stuck, as divided, as gridlocked. You know, so I can't say I've actually heard it come back from them in a large audience, but you certainly see lots of evidence of it.
I wonder if I could answer that just for 1 second. I want to address that. One thing that you need to recognize, I think, is that when you look at that particular issue, basically ever since this country was founded, it's been an attempt to find an advantage. It is a democracy, but there are people who are trying to win. And oftentimes, minorities are really regarded as going to lean in one direction or another, and so there's an attempt to disenfranchise to gain an advantage. It's no secret that at the turn of the century in the black laws, the black codes, that actually one of the questions that was given to blacks to decide whether or not they could qualify for registration to vote to register as a voter, how many bubbles are in that bar of soap? That's a true question. So oftentimes what we find about disenfranchisement isn't necessarily race per se, so much as it is trying to find an advantage, having an idea of what outcomes might be if they were to vote. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Let me just add one more to this. This is not so much how to bring more diverse people in, but the lesson of the fight against racism for this fight. You know, for most of the history of the South after the Civil War, there were white primaries, which were primaries where only whites could vote. By law in Texas, explicitly, it excluded African Americans from voting, and it was until 1944 the Supreme Court finally struck it down, but because of techniques that, like you were talking about, it wasn't until 1965 that it effectively ended. The white primary was obviously, it should be obvious to everybody, is a denial of democracy. But the one virtue the South could claim is that whites were the majority. Now, what we've done is we've created a green primary, because we have a primary you've got to qualify in order to be able to run effectively in the general election. And in that green primary, it's not the majority who get to participate, it's the tiniest fraction of the 1% that gets to participate. So we've created an exclusionary primary that is an essential part to being part of this political process, which is more exclusionary, radically more exclusionary than what happened in the white primary situation. It is as much a denial of what the meaning of democracy is, and we ought to rally about the moral point, about the immorality of a democracy denying people on the basis of something as irrelevant as the wealth you happen to have as you go into a political process.
Thank you, Professor Lessig.
Thank you. My name is Steve McGrath. Thank you all for being here. You very eloquently stated the problem is the corruption of money in politics, and that's because elections are ridiculously expensive. What does a post-campaign reform election look like? For example, is it free access to the FCC-regulated airwaves?
So let me start, because there is a big difference between what's being emphasized. In my view, the core problem is the way money is raised. I mean, Trevor was talking a little bit about this when he said he doesn't really care about how much is being spent, so we're agreeing. I'm not sure how much should be spent. The problem is how it's raised. So a solution for me is just to change the way we raise money. The old way we changed it with presidential elections is to have public funding. I support ideas like were described, Hedrick described, and that Trevor described of small dollar funded elections. If everybody had a voucher, a $100 voucher that they used to fund elections, then the vast majority of Americans would be the funders. They would be the relevant funders, just like the vast majority are the relevant voters. And so you would spread out the funder influence. And in my view, that would remove the corrupting influence that's created by a system where it's just the very few who are funding the elections.
I would go beyond that, though. I think there are two things going on. One is the election. We're focused on it in this country, but what we don't focus on is what happens after the election. We have election results, and the lobbyists in Washington go to work the day after the election, and their influence runs until the next election. We've done our job. So we need to have some way of affecting what happens after people get into office. And I think Trevor's comment about, and it was one of the options up here, about not allowing anybody to give money or give financial support to anybody in government before whom they have business. Why should lobbyists and corporations or trade unions or anybody be able to donate to the congressional committees that are going to vote on the legislation? So that's not just raising money in a campaign, that is deciding whether or not your government can be bought one way or another. So I think we've got to be, it isn't just how does an election look. It is how does our government, to pick up from Bill, how does our government look under a new system? And we need to have it look like it's not bought.
I want to ask you one question, if I may. One of the things that I find when I talk about this stuff is that campaign finance reform makes people's eyes glaze over. And oftentimes what they're looking for is a single bullet. Are you, in a sense, asking for what's the most expeditious, efficient, well thought through plan in order to on the other side of this? Is that, in a sense, what you're asking?
Yes.
So,
There is
Mr.
no,
Lessig, would
there
you
is,
say?
there is no single bullet. It has to be multiple things. You have to have an effective FEC, you have to have something limiting lobbyists, you have to do something for small donors, and you may have to have a constitutional amendment to give Congress the power to regulate finance. So that's a whole bunch of things already, and I haven't thought of half the things that other people would think of.
One thing I would add to what the other panelists have said is that in many cases, I think it isn't the absolute amount of money that is spent rather than the way in which the communication occurs. One of the things we could do much better as a democracy is to have fewer of these negative ads barraging people on television and more communicating of views and ideas and discussion. So maybe you structure a system where there are additional funding benefits to people who participate in debates, so that citizens have an opportunity to hear and see the candidates themselves rather than just the values of a television producer. And that wouldn't be particularly costly. So I think there are a variety of ways that we could improve the communication in all of this.
Excellent. Sir?
Bill, I want to ask you, you brought it up that there would be a citizens' Congress afterwards. I think partly because of poor media coverage of this event. A lot of people are scratching their head out here saying, where's that, what's that, what's involved, how can I get involved? Could you give them the details, so to speak?
Thank you for reminding me. The Cliffs Resort down in Shell Beach is a hotel where we're having our Congress over the next 3 days. You're welcome to come down there and join us. We were looking for $100 donations for the day, $250 for the week. If you're a student, we said you're free. The $100 is not a profit. We're a nonprofit 527. The attempt is to simply pay our way as we go along here. Every nickel and dime that we've put together in this effort has been just through local people. We've not solicited any big corporations or anything else because we think this is the right way to do it. It gives people a chance to invest and be a part of that. So if you'd like to join us, we're going to cover topics such as, Professor Lessig talked about Article 5, or we're going to talk about public financing, we're going to talk about messaging and polling. One of the things that this issue suffers from, in my estimation at least, is that it's not a concise message. while everybody has, is feeling the effects of this, if you think about the 26th Amendment, which was giving 18-year-olds the right to vote, that amendment passed in just 100 days. It was exceedingly fast, and we all know why, because we remember that time when 18-year-olds were being sent off to war, and 18-year-olds said, well, if I'm going to go off to war, I should have some right to say what this country's policy is. But we haven't been able to craft that message as succinctly as we need to, so that each of you can say to your neighbors in the sort of Grover Norquist simplistic way, no new taxes, and everybody knows what it means. So we need to work on that messaging. We're going to talk about the 11 different amendments that are proposed before before Congress right now. We're going to talk about the American Anti-Corruption Act that, these two gentlemen were co-authors of. We're going to talk about a number of items that we think will be of relevant to you to help you cut through the maze, as I talked about, and really get down to simple things so that there is no single bullet approach, but there is a reasonable understanding of how to approach this and focus, and that's what we're trying to do. So if you'd like to be a part of that, Chris will be there with his voting tools, and it'll help us to find strategies and levels of agreement in those strategies. It starts at 9 o'clock on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and we'll go as long as we have material for, but probably until 5 o'clock. Please come and join us. We'd love to have your help and participation.
Excellent. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Bob Durkin. I think the voter voucher idea is a great idea for returning democracy back to the average American. My question is for Dr. Lessig, or Professor Lessig. Since donating to the May Day PAC, I've had a number of people ask me, who are the matching donors?
Yeah. So first, thanks for the point about the voucher. The voucher idea was proposed originally, Rick Hazen and also Bruce Ackerman and Ian Ayers had pushed it. And one point to keep clear about how this would work, following up on what Hedrick was saying, it's certainly true that we need lots of reform. But one of the reasons why lobbyists are going to fight like hell to block the voucher is that if campaigns were funded through vouchers, they would lose an enormous amount of their power. Because right now, their power comes from them being the choke point. They channel money into the political system. And if they no longer were channeling because everybody else was spending the money in the vouchers, the value of their money would shrink. Now, so in our May Day PAC, the way we set this up, the insane way to set it up was we have to raise $1 million in 30 days. And we only collect that if we got it matched. Then we're going to raise $5 million in 30 days. We only collect that if we got that matched too. We raised the $1 million in 13 days, and we got it matched last week. And on the 4th, it's going to be announced publicly, but I'm going to tell you secretly right now who the matches are, because I'm incredibly proud of the match. There are 6 people who matched. 2 of them are perhaps 2 of Silicon Valley's most important innovators and exactly in the opposite ends of the political spectrum. One of them is Reid Hoffman, and the other one is Peter Thiel. Reid Hoffman runs LinkedIn. Peter Thiel is a libertarian who started PayPal. Then there are 2 venture people who are in the internet's most interesting venture firm that created Twitter and created Tumblr, created Kickstarter, Brad Burnham and Fred and Joanne Wilson. And then Chris Anderson, who is the curator of the TED conference, is one of the matches. And the 6th is a guy named Vin Ryan who started Iron Mountain, and he's been in this fight for about 20 years. Now, what I'm proud about in that match is that these are people who are pushing, they're not typical political people. They're not in politics. They're not typically in this game. They're pushing for radically changing the way our democracy works to bring back something that's about innovation and creativity. And so these are exactly the kind of people that I was hoping would come forward and match.
Okay, so
but it's a secret. Please don't tell anybody.
I was going to say, now that these names have been made public, are we going to see this on the website anywhere?
Yeah, no, it's going to be announced. So it's a stupid game that you've got to play with mainstream media. Like, you need to be able to tie it to an event with mainstream media if they're going to cover it. So I'm being facetious, obviously, if I'm telling you it's not secret. We've actually sent it out to all the people who pledged. We told them this last week when we collected their money.
Well, I don't
but it's going to be
see
on
it.
the 4th. On the 4th, it'll be the big announcement of it.
Okay, I'll have to look at my email again. I
Yeah.
don't remember seeing it.
By the way, I don't know if people are aware of this or not, but if you really want to see where money comes from in elections, if you haven't seen it yet, there's a wonderful website called opensecrets.org. Open Secrets is a nonpartisan research organization, and they track the money in Washington. If you want to have an education about where the money comes from and dispel a lot of rumors and myths about who gives what, go to that website, opensecrets.org.
All right, thank you. In fairness to staff and our guests, we're going to go for about 5 more minutes.
I'm Dr. Douglas Shave. I'm a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst, and over the 40 years I've worked, one of the most devastating things is financial insecurity, which other than the 1% is now kind of predominant in everyone's life. I was quite excited by Move on Wall Street, and it kind of came on scene and then disappeared. Do you have any theories of what happened, and are there any lessons to learn in terms of helping to organize what you're trying to do?
Is that, you're asking about Occupy?
Occupy, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, I'm particularly interested in the question you asked because having covered the civil rights movement, some of those other movements which were really quite successful, I was trying to understand why this didn't have a greater impact. First place, I think we need to acknowledge what impact it did have. If you talk today about the 99% and the 1% to Americans, they get it. That didn't exist before Occupy. So they put that concept into people's mind. If you take a look at the media today, in the degree to which the media now covers inequality of income and financial insecurity, it was greatly propelled by Occupy. The media really wasn't paying a lot of attention to inequality of income before that. Yeah, there were a few financial writers and there were a few pieces back on the business page, but the media didn't pay much attention to that. So they achieved something in terms of affecting our awareness. I think organizationally why they failed to have a more sustained impact was twofold. Number one, they did not have clear goals which they articulated. If you go to take a look at Martin Luther King, or if you look at the environmental movement, I mean, the desegregation in Birmingham, we want to sit at the lunch counters, we want to have the jobs, we want to ride on the buses, we want to eat at the restaurants. There were very clear demands, and they had a very clear leadership structure. So if the city of Birmingham, the mayor and the main stores in Birmingham wanted to negotiate, they had somebody to negotiate with. Well, Occupy was deliberately Vermont town meeting Democratic. Everybody spoke for themselves. There was nobody to speak to. And everybody was able to articulate their own issues. You can't run a movement like that. There's no way you can raise money, there's no way you can engage other people, and there's no way you can articulate goals that will actually move the society to change. And I mean, that's the conclusion. They were more a cry of protest than an activist movement. And so it can be picked up. I mean, their ideas can be picked up and in other movements. And as I say, they're going on now. But they have to be organized, clear in their goals, and well organized in their structure.
All four of you, thank you very much for doing your own work and moving this forward. Thank you.
All right, I'd like to remind everyone that we will have refreshments out on the front, and the authors will be available for book signings if you have an individual question. But unfortunately, we are going to have to cut it off, so you get the last question, sir.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Eric Vium. It occurs to me that this culture of corruption and influence is alive and well in California and in Sacramento. What is the role of addressing this crisis at the state and also of building momentum of reform state by state that eventually topples Washington?
So there's a big strategy push out there to say that we should be building this first at the state level and then at the national level. And I'm a little skeptical of that strategy for two reasons. First, I'm not sure we can afford to wait at the national level. I don't think we have 10 years to fix this at the national level. We can't wait 10 years to get climate change legislation. We can't wait. And as Jim Hansen said in his last book, the thing blocking climate change legislation is money in politics, period. So we can't wait, number one. And number two, states are very different. So I would agree with you, having lived in California for 9 years. California has the same sorts of issues that exist at the federal level, and so it's perfectly ripe for the same kind of remedies. Same with New York, same with Illinois. But I'm not sure about Vermont. I'm not sure about New Hampshire. You know, those are different kind of democracies. And to think of all these states as exactly the same, I think, kind of dilutes the movement. So when you go into Vermont and you say, yeah, look at your state legislator, we've got to end the corruption of the state legislators, they say, what's the corruption of our state legislators? In New Hampshire, there are 400 state legislators. State legislators, 400 in a population of 1.3 million. So, you know, it's just a different game. So I think we need to be precise about where the problem is that we're talking about. And I'm happy to say, which is why I'm happy to march with Kai and his group tomorrow, here in California is one really big problem to fight, like it is in Washington. And that's where we ought to focus our energy, on the big problems to fight.
I'm going to take a slightly different view. I don't think the state and the national campaign are in opposition to each other. I think the biggest problem we have is to engage enough people to have enough groundswell to begin to persuade the politicians they've got to change, or we can vote them out of office. And that means we have to engage people. I think people get engaged in their local environment. I don't care what the state is. If you're in California, just as the questioner said, you're concerned about the problems here. Up in Washington State, they're concerned about them. In Illinois, they're concerned about them. I think it's absolutely critical for people to feel as though they can connect with these issues in their lives. And what I'm afraid of, Larry, to be honest with, some people are capable of looking at the national campaign and saying, I can relate to it. But I've heard way too many audiences of people say, my God, that's the top of Mount Everest. How do I start climbing the hill? And I think you start climbing the hill in your city. It's significant, for example, that SeaTac, the little town that surrounds the Seattle-Tacoma airport, changed the minimum wage. It's significant that Seattle is now doing it. It's significant that Seattle is now getting ready to do public funding and so on. People need to find their connection and build. And I don't think these two things have to be seen in opposition. We should be doing them in tandem.
So, but let's be clear about if we have a disagreement, because I'm not sure we do. Obviously, at the local level, you need to be pushing for the issues that are important locally. And you have been a part of local efforts to rally states to call on Congress to pass constitutional amendments. And what the Kai's movement is doing is trying to rally California to call for an Article 5 convention. Those are local activities, and I absolutely support that.
Right.
All that I'm saying is, I have found it weakens the movement to equate the kind of corruption that's going on in Washington and maybe Sacramento to the problems of government that might exist in a state like Vermont. They're not the same. So there might be a minimum wage issue that's the same. There might be a need to make sure that we're taking care of people who can't take care of themselves. That might be the same. But I just think it's really important not to make people think, oh, the problem in Washington is like the problem with my state representative. Well, I don't see a problem with my state representative, so I'm not sure if I see a problem in Washington, right? So that's the only narrow point that I'm trying to make. It is not the case, I think, that we have the same kind of corruption that exists in Washington across the country in every context. We do in lots of contexts, and I want to fight that. And I want to join with people to fight that. But I think the fear I have is if we spend all of our time fighting the local, here, corruption issue, it slows the really urgent corruption.
Well, I'd love to carry this on, but this is late, and maybe this is an issue we should be talking about tomorrow, Bill, rather than taking people's time now, because I think this is a fruitful conversation, not a dead-end conversation.
Can I give 10 seconds to that before you go, though? I would just like to say that I actually agree with both of them, but it's an amalgamation because there are some people in this room, including myself, that have gone and sat through tedious city council meetings or talked to county supervisors, et cetera, and you feel like you're pushing rope. You don't know where to go with your frustration. And so in some places, it's good to go to the town halls. Maybe you have receptive ears. In some places, county supervisors. In some places, state legislators. The point is that this is a common thread no matter what level of government you are, and we have to push wherever we can get traction. And that's really important because too many of us get weighed down with all the things we have to do in our life, and we'll get issue fatigue. So we want to see some traction somewhere. That's what's really important, and that's why I think it's important to be fluid and to have, in my opinion, some kind of national strategy. It doesn't mean you can't change. You go into a ball game with an idea, and then the defense comes at you, and you have to adapt. And that's what I'm proposing. Thank you all for coming.
And we have a valuation on the screen. So we already have 107 folks. How much do you agree or disagree? You learned something new, interesting. We have only 2 more quick ones to do after, but we want to finish on what the people say, the people who showed up. The next one, great job, over 140 already. Next one, how committed, oh, excuse me, that's called human error. I hit the wrong button. Here we go. Next one, are you going to be a new agitator? Will you take action when you leave here? We gave one example. It doesn't mean it's just that as an example. Outstanding. And then the final one is overall tonight. Was tonight successful? Was it a good use of your time? Of course, we have a biased group who stayed to the end. And so how much you get out of this? If we had all 380 who we started with, it might be a different vote. But here we go. We want to at least show you what you think, what your feedback is, learn something new. That's amazing. That's one of the highest I've ever seen. That's really high. And then also tonight being successful and being new agitators. Look at this. We only have 7, 11, 12% saying no. And this one person who gave it a 2, I want to know why you think that. I mean that. I want to know why somebody feels a certain way. But just to show you, even at that 7.5 or 75% level, you still have something like, 94% saying, yeah, they're going to do something or get involved. So again, thanks everybody. Mike, you want the last word for the night?
Thank you for showing up. We appreciate your participation.